Aloha, all, and welcome to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle that includes all of us here and many others beyond. This week seems to be a fitting sort of rejoinder to the exceptional calm that we took up for conversation last week with a speaker from the Vaishnava tradition of Hinduism. We are looking this week at the idea of completing a cycle, which in terms of this year's theme of self-crafting seems to be a really good idea to just go back, complete the cycle, look at what we have done. So I would like to introduce you to someone who has made something of his own cyclic journey. He's coming to us right now from Seattle. His name is Peeyush Kumar. And when I asked him, having heard him speak on the Gayatri mantra during one of our meditation classes on the Gayatri mantra, I asked him how he got his understanding. Did he study at the feet of his grandparents, perhaps? And he told me, well, that interestingly enough, many of his books of mythology had in fact come from his grandparents, and that he was brought up in a traditional sort of Hindu household, that he pretty much departed from, at least from that tradition when he was a teen. So if I'm getting the story right, Peeyush, a few years back, he found himself, after a lot of questioning, coming to the West, where he works. He's a senior analyst, I believe, at Microsoft. His work is in service, co-creating a world where conscious individuals shape conscious societies based on our sovereign choice for all relations. This is a world where we feel protected, vitalized, and can play, grow, and co-create for our future, our Terra Nova. Beautiful, huh? So as he did this return journey and became more interested in a deeper spirituality, and having looked into many spiritual and philosophical traditions, he was introduced, or perhaps we should say reintroduced, to Kashmiri Shaivism. And the reason that this completes a circle is, guess where his grandparents are from? Kashmir. So it's really a beautiful story of cyclic return, it seems to me. However, this is done at a much higher level. And I suspect as we take up this conversation on completing a cycle, it won't exactly be just making a circle and coming back to where we started. I imagine completing a cycle is a little bit different from that, but we'll see what Peeyush has to tell us on that. Peeyush, let me hand it over to you, if you would, please.
Thank you, Renee. And it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. That was quite an introduction, Renee. Thank you so much. Just small clarification. So I work as a researcher and not an analyst. My grandparents were from Kashmir, but not the present day Kashmir. It was back in the day when India and Pakistan were basically part of the same subcontinent, and there were less boundaries or borders, and we had this Kashmiri Shaivism that actually came up from the northern part of Kashmir, or northern part of the Indian subcontinent. And that included a lot of the present day Afghanistan, a lot of the northern Kashmir that is part of India, and then also northern Punjab that is also part of Pakistan. So it was a big region, and now it's divided into so many small states and countries and so on. But sort of coming back here and coming back to these traditions, I mean, it is indeed like completing a cycle. I seems like I went through a journey and then came back here. And it is also very fascinating, and I'm sure it's not coincidental that we are talking about these things at this time, when during this time, just following the solar cycles and the movement of the stars and everything. Traditionally, we also say that this is a part where we complete, or we're coming to a completion of a cycle. As we go into the Christmas time and the winter solstice, and that time of December 21st to December 25th, when the sun, in the horizon actually appears to become still, and that's because of the particular shape that the sun takes, right? And there is a natural pause at the completion of a cycle before the newer cycle begins, and that's the new solar cycle, with the new year that becomes. So, but there's a lot more to talk about it, and I would like to share sort of like how I experienced these, completion of cycles and how they connected with me. But I've compiled a few pictures and slides, so I would like to start there just so that you can have some beautiful images. So before I actually go into and sharing my perspectives on this, I just want to kind of get an idea, maybe a word, maybe a phrase. What does cycles mean to you? And we can just go popcorn style, just whatever comes to you. How do cycles resonate with you? How do you interpret that?
Circles.
Repetition.
Beginnings, middles, and ends.
Mm-hmm.
Spiral.
Nature.
Seasons.
Very beautiful. Very beautiful.
Turning of a wheel.
Turning of a wheel. Wow.
Repetition.
One of the common themes that I heard across these were cycles that, sort of what does the symbolism of cycles stand to us, right? I mean, I heard repetitions, I heard nature and seasons, and I heard the turning of a wheel and so on, right? One of the things that happen that, as we look out into the universe is really a cyclical movement of the divine consciousness in space and time. Now, these are very heavy words, but, if we look at like all the way from the largest galaxies to the smallest atoms, right? The way we understand, the way we picture, imagine, the way scientists imagine the workings of an atom, they are all cyclical in nature. Our calendars are based on cycles. Our bodies adapt to cycles, and that sort of gives us a way to measure ourselves in this big cosmology. In the eternal consciousness, consciousness is really not divided into space and time, and I'll actually share a little bit more about that. But as we talk about cycles, one of the common themes that we heard was about rhythms, right? I mean, I heard natural rhythms and seasonal rhythms, right? There's daily cycles, and we can, if we with any level of awareness, I think we are very aware of the rhythms that happen personally within us, right? Women are very attuned to the moon cycles. That's a rhythm, right? That happens. We as people, are attuned to, and generally across cultures, we are attuned to solar cycles. There is spring, and then there is summer, and there's fall, and there's winter, and then naturally spring comes up again. And our cultures and customs and traditions and stories are attuned to these rhythms, right? So there's very personal rhythms that we experience within ourselves, right? Now, as we become, as we go more and more further into our spiritual paths, what we realize is that we are actually not individual entities, right? We are always influenced by bigger and bigger forces in a way, right? So, I mean, I'm not an individual person. I'm impacted by people around me. So there's a bigger coherency there. So that invites its own rhythm, the rhythm of the group. As we become bigger and, sort of like expand that more larger and larger, we come to a level of maybe a country, there's natural rhythms of the country, right? There's holiday seasons and, like, for example, the holiday season here in the US is really right now. And, it really starts with Thanksgiving, goes into the new year and so on. The holiday season in India is around the Diwali season, which happens around October or November, right? And naturally, like people adapt to these kind of holiday seasons that happen. So, there's a natural rhythm that we are influenced by that is actually not just personally determined, but, it's collectively determined. And as we continue expanding, the Earth, the solar cycles is dependent on how the Earth moves around the sun and so on. And then there's very cosmological cycles, things that we can see tangibly and things that just naturally influence us, right? And if if you're familiar with like astrological sort of like aspects of understanding the world, I mean, astrology is all about rhythms, right? Rhythms of different kinds of planets and rhythms of the zodiac, and rhythms of the planet in these zodiacs and so on. And that is actually one of the key things that I wanted to share is that the rhythms are not just, there's not just one rhythm, there's many rhythms. And these rhythms are not just tied to us as an individual, but they're also tied, we are tied within this global cosmic play of this divine consciousness. And earlier I said, that really the nature of cycles is, the divine consciousness naturally occurs in cycles in space and time, right? But I want to take a step back and say something here, right? All these ideas of cycles, the ideas of space and time, the ideas of anything, I mean, they are concepts, they are constructs. In the utmost enlightenment, and I think many people have these experiences. The nature of space and time is only a construct because we have an impression of it. Now, when we release that, the complete essence of being is just in the experience itself. Now, the experience does not distinguish between times and spaces and so on. Life is ever changing and ever evolving and ever, doing whatever it is doing. And in our own experience of life, we are completely when we are completely in the experience of life, we are just being with that experience. So these are all concepts that helps us understand. And naturally, very subconsciously, our mind interprets things in certain ways. It helps us keep record of time and space, and this happens through measuring, space and time. And one of the natural ways to measure space and time is through cycles, and not just one cycle. We talk about multiple cycles, right? But what is the nature of reality beyond all of that, right? I mean, reality, and this really comes from, a lot of the traditions talk about it. Kashmiri Shaivism also talks about it quite a bit. The nature of existence is really eternal and omnipresent and omniscient. As we experience life, right? I mean, we organize and construct life in sections and groups. We determine things that we want to do now, and we determine things that we want to do later, right? A lot of the doubts and questions that come to us very personally is because there are certain things that can happen now, and there are certain things that cannot happen now. And, we kind of, in our intellect, in our mind, try to organize all of these things into a fashion that we can follow. But when we realize, really all the things that we want to do, either we have done them at certain point in time, or we will be doing that at certain point in time, right? And just that thought, I don't know if, some of you have experienced that, but just that thought that, yes, I can actually, right now in this moment, I don't have to do all of those things, because the notion of time itself, past, present, and future, it's all happening at the same time in a way. It's all happening, in an eternity, right? And whatever I cannot do now, I can always do it later. And whatever is not happening to me now can always happen later. And when we realize that, I mean, the amount of peace and understanding that brings, I mean, that's just beautiful. And that's the time, when we sort of take a break from everyday life, sit back, take a deep breath, realize and expand ourselves just a little bit more. And that expansion is just this realization that we are bigger than what we thought we were. Our identities are bigger than what we thought we were. And, at the other extreme, really, there's no identities. We are just beings. We are eternal beings, and we are present everywhere, and we know everything, right? If we don't know it now, we'll know at some point in time, but we know, period, And this is really important to realize as well when I talk about cycles, because what happens is that a lot of the times, a lot of the suffering that we go through, a lot of the doubts and questions, and it really comes to the aspect when we compulsively attach to certain things more than we were supposed to. And I'll actually say a little bit more about that. So I'll come back to this. So let me actually talk about cycles, right? So this is actually coming from Kashmiri Shaivism, really, and I've experienced that so much in my life that it's just so ingrained in terms of like how when I'm experiencing things now, how I actually see them, right? So in Shaivism, there's Shiva and Shakti, and what we say is that Shiva and Shakti are basically non-dual with each other. Now, of course, like, what does that really mean? And that means a lot of different things, and maybe that would be a talk for another time. But in this aspect of the cycles, each cycle can be divided into groups, right? So somebody actually said, cycle has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So let's explore that a little bit more. So there is a creation in the cycle. There's a maintenance in the cycle. There's a natural destruction in the cycle. And then there's something called concealment and grace. Now, what is creation? Now, creation is the first point where something happens, something new occurs. Now, it could be very physical and very practical, where like you start a new project, or you start a new relationship, or and so on. It could be a little bit more esoteric than that. You can have there's a natural creation of an emotion as well. There's a natural creation of an emotion such as happiness, or an emotion such as sadness, right? There's a point where me as an entire being decided, consciously or subconsciously, that this is the emotion that is being created, right? So there's a natural creation there. Even beyond that, there is a creation, like even more esoterically. There's so many subtle levels to that as well. Even beyond that, there's a creation of the impressions of what is happening in the outside world. So these impressions, there's a natural creation to the impressions, and and naturally, all of those things go through the cycle. Now, there's a natural cycle that happens, that goes from creation to maintenance and destruction, right? There's a natural creation of something. I created a project, I maintained the project, and maintenance is a very, kind of an overt encompassing word, but really what it means is that it's the time when we nourish and give attention to this particular creation, right? Now, in terms of the Hindu mythology, the creative force is really determined by Brahma, and the maintenance force is determined by Vishnu, right? And destruction is determined by Shiva, but not Shiva, who's the eternal abstract present, but Shiva as an entity, Shiva as a manifested entity. And again, I said a lot of things in just that one line, and maybe that would be a point of exploration for some other time. But that's just the natural rhythm, natural cycle of anything. There's the beginning, that is the creation. There's a maintenance, and there's the destruction, right? But there's a little bit more to that, and this is where a lot of the ways the world works, and a lot of the things that happen really make sense to me, and how it comes back to me, really, right? I think a lot of us, in whatever traditions we have learned through, we have recognized that there was a point where there was absolute nothingness, right? And from that absolute nothingness, the first source, the first bang, like the scientists call it Big Bang. In a lot of the indigenous cultures, they call it the first blast, or the first ray, and so on, right? I mean, the first ray happens, right? And that sets things into motion, and from that motion, there's a natural separation of the thing that's separated from the divine in a way, right? And this natural separation leads to the nature of life, right? If everything was just unified and unity, there would be no life. There would be nothing to do. Everyone's in this absolute bliss, right? But the nature of consciousness is also that the consciousness itself is absolute, but the act that actually separates anything out from the consciousness and that builds towards it, it's really to explore consciously the extent of this absolute infinite consciousness. And that's why, we break, one of the ways I understand this, we break this sort of like continuous, infinite, absolute realm into a lot of like specific, discrete pieces, and these are discrete individuals, discrete people, discrete feelings, discrete, impressions, and so on, right? And so the nature of concealment, so actually before I go to concealment, let me share a little bit more about destruction, right? So, as seasons, right? As the seasons happen, creation really starts, when we think in terms of metaphors, the creation of life on Earth, the plant life, for example, right? I mean, the creation starts right after winter and, like really into spring. And towards the end of the spring, that entire season of spring is about nourishing and flourishing. The sun nourishes the soil and the plants grow. And towards the end of the summer, or, I would say like somewhere in the middle of the summer, life is full and in abundance, right? And right at the peak when it's in abundance, there's the fall that comes in and it destroys everything, right? And that point, right before the destruction, when that happens, that is the point of utmost pleasure and utmost joy. That is the point of the utmost ecstasy. And it's because when destruction happens, it destroys any notion of objectivity. It destroys, when we are really happy, when, in the points of profound ecstasy or profound joy, our mind and we are not aware necessarily of the objects of joy and the objects of ecstasy. We are just aware of the experience of ecstasy and the experience of joy, right? And that is only possible. That is not a status. That's not a stationary state. That is only possible because right in that moment is when everything gets destroyed, and then it comes back to that absoluteness. That comes back to that silence, and that silence is really, where the cycle begins again. Now, what happens, and what happens a lot of the time, is that in that point of ecstasy, in that point of joy, we as humans, we have so many impressions that we create in our mind, and that's just the nature of being human. Really, as we take birth, part of us actually gets separated from the divine, right? And in that separation, we have all these different impressions of the world, our understandings, perspectives of the world that gets created. And in that ecstasy, what happens is that entire experience of joy with those impressions gets condensed into a seed, small seed that lies within us. And over time, that seed gets buried with so many different experiences and life and everything that it lies inside us, and it naturally drives a subconscious and unconscious ways of being. When we have very traumatic experiences, right? I mean, those traumatic experiences are because the seeds are so the unresolved traumatic experiences are the ones where the seeds are so sowed deep down into a consciousness, that it's just very, there's so many different things that have been connected to it, and it's hard to actually bring that out, right? And this is the nature of concealment. It is because of this that we as humans are motivated to experience the infinite potentialities of the absolute in our own specific ways. All right. And then there's a moment of grace. And grace is when, just in a moment, but because of our own spiritual experiences, because of it could be as simple as just in this one moment having a conversation with a friend, or in the presence of a guru, an enlightened being, in other words, or just through our own experiences and our own meditations and contemplations, our own hardships, there's a moment of realization, that aha moment. When that happens, grace really comes in as a full force of water, let's say, and it really simplifies the seed, the hard sown seed that happened. It really simplifies that, and it brings us back into that notion that existed, pre-creation, and that's the moment of silence, and that's the moment of grace. And in cycles, we experience this over and over again. We create something, we maintain something, and then something is destroyed. And in that destruction, because of the impressions that lie in a being, there's concealment of certain things. And because of that concealment, there's an opportunity for grace to come in. And when that grace comes in, we progress in a spiritual experience or a spiritual path, or we learn something about ourselves, we learn something about the world and the nature. Yeah, I want to take a moment here just for all of this to really sink in. And that is why one of the questions that at least I ask myself, when I get into anything new, anything, any relationship or any project, any experience in life, really, any engagement, is to really understand what are the impressions that I am coming in with. The other question that I ask myself is, in any of these moments, when I find myself in these moments of hardships and tension, is in which of these aspects am I attaching to? Naturally, we naturally have a lot of attachment to either the creation part of things or the maintenance part of things. We don't want life to end. We want life to flourish and continue. Although in India, there's a sect of followers of Shiva. They are called Aghoris, and they have a pretty, I would say, very eccentrically bad reputation, because these are the people who have devoted their life to really embody the destruction aspect of Shiva. And so they have rituals and rites, that from any moral and ethical standards seem pretty extreme, but that's because for any regular human being to be in their presence, they are working in these vibrations and in these ways that is just it's very uncomfortable. So then the question comes back: what are we attaching to, and where can I release attachment so that I can just experience this natural process of life, the cycles of life? I can see things being created, maintained, destroyed, and so on. I can enjoy the nature of concealment as well as the nature of grace. So I'll pause here and just open it up for questions and discussions and so on.
I have a question. When you talk about concealment, you're talking about the experience that we have of the wounded story, or the wounded story, or the experience that gets to be a seed within us as a preconceived idea, or that we take inside of ourselves, and that is what is concealed. And the moment of grace is when we're aware of that concealment, or that we feel a freedom from that concealment. Would you speak about that change from concealment to grace?
Yeah, absolutely. In those wounded stories, what really happens is that these impressions are so crystallized The nature of the mind is that it just likes to explore, right? And it likes to explore very discreetly. So it does not work as a continuum of the experience, right? It works as one idea at a time, and it goes into that idea, and then it makes connections. So it's very discrete, very individuating, in a way, in that way. But not all of those thoughts and all of the experiences that a mind has becomes a wounded stories. There's only certain things that become wounded stories, and that's because when these ideas happen in the synchronicity of very intense experiences, and the nature of intensity is actually the nature of joy and the nature of like extreme pleasure, in a way. When those happens at the same time, that is when we experience concealment, and that is when we experience because that is when we experience trauma, and these traumas and these concealment is when these stories and these thoughts, they crystallize and go very deep down into our bodies, right? And the moment of grace happens really when, through certain kinds of experiences, there's many different ways grace can come into someone's experience. Either it could be self-realized, or it could be realized through the presence of enlightened beings. There's just one word that they can say, that can just really shed light into this things beyond those stories in a way, right? And the nature of grace is really to bring us back into that essence of the absoluteness, the essence of silence.
Peeyush, thank you so much. I'm in a program for studying psychology, and I think Diana asked the question about that transition from concealment to grace. And I just recently did a little study on Carl Rogers, who kind of turned the world's psychology upside down when he introduced the idea that the real therapy, and I think that's the model for psychology. The therapeutic value is when we take something from concealment and release it. And his idea was something that you mentioned. It could be just a talk with a really good friend. When someone just hears you and gets you where you're at, that whatever it is concealed no longer has the power that holds it down, and it can sort of see the light of day. And I think, it's like hitting the reset button. It's like hitting reset on the computer and having it just sort of level things out. And those constrictions that were concealed are released. And some people call it an aha moment, but I like this 5 path approach because it gives a format to how that actually occurs. And I think, as you said, it could come in quite a number of ways. It could come through self-realization, meditation, psychedelic therapy, and any number of means. But thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for that reflection, David.
Maybe on the same theme, once you have this release, is there a new synthesis or a new unity, a new resetting, as was said before, but a new way of seeing the world? Could you say a bit more about some of those aspects?
Oh, that's a beautiful question, Maurice. Yeah, certainly. One of the things that I really believe in is that all the experiences that we have, are self-created in a way. And it's a big statement, but really, the question becomes like, who is this self, right? And I'm not talking about me as an individual self, really, right? This self is really that absoluteness, that, the space, the entity, in a way, if you could even say it that way, that contains all the possibilities of consciousness, right? And the nature of consciousness and the nature of life in general, like everything that happens, I believe that it has a role and it has a purpose. that it works with in the grand cosmology, right? And so there's a purpose to concealment as well. There's a purpose for traumas. Traumas don't happen for no reason. Generally, the way we understand as very individuals, is that very empirical individuals, is that these traumas help us learn something more about ourselves. Maybe it will also help us to learn more about the world, right? But in a larger way, if I can shed light to that, it really helps us. It helps us to actually bring about a manifestation of the infinite, one of the infinite possibilities of the world that has never been experienced before. So it has a very crucial role that we really play in that, right? And the nature of coming back to grace is allowing us to actually step into a newer cycle, because we are not really caught up by those stories. We are not imprisoned by those stories that were, that are coming down from, I don't know how many years ago, maybe even generations ago, and so on, right? And so really, the moments of grace, and however it comes, is a very profound moment in that way, because what it's telling us is that now we are ready to actually explore a different aspect of the divine in a way that we have never explored before. And not just me as a person, like as the entire experience of the cosmos, the entire experience of every being, every element, everything that exists, all together have never experienced that before. Now we are ready to actually step into that cycle.
Peeyush, maybe this is an appropriate point at which I could ask this question. A mentor of mine speaks very highly of the importance of completing cycles. And you spoke about everything that we experience is self-created in some way. So if we could take that as a truism, that it is important to complete a cycle, does that mean that it allows us to then get the full learning that we could get from it? Whereas if we don't complete it, we don't get that same step up in learning. We haven't gone through those 5 stages.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. One of the things that really came to me when you said that was there are many cycles that are undergoing at any time. So, there's, and who's to say like, which is the longest cycle that we are in and which is the shortest cycle we are in, right? So as at any point, the essence of being a human is in itself a cycle. The entire life cycle is a cycle in itself that is happening also. The entire experience of being a human, the essence of being a human is that a part of us actually gets separated from the divine, just for the time being, but it does get separated from the divine. And then we experience this cycle of being a human. Now, there are other cycles, shorter in length and longer in length that are also happening. There are, for longer cycles, one of the ways to understand is that the story of the human is probably not the first time the story of the humans have been written, right? The stories of countries and societies, these are ever evolving stories that happen, and we play a part in that. If you believe in reincarnation and things like that, right? The soul that really came into this body, if it came into incarnation at another time, then it would have a very different kind of life that it would be living, right? That's sort of like one way to understand, how we are really defined by the times that we are born in, the spaces that we are born in, and so on. So, from that perspective, there's a natural, I call it, a lot of people have different names, right? In the essential experience of life, the true nature, in Tao, you call it the Tao, right? There's a natural sort of progress towards this notion of working towards the cycle, right? So every moment we are actually starting a new cycle and completing a new cycle. I mean, with each breath, there is a cycle that happens as well, right? Now, when we are really listening, I think, that is the key, at least for me, is that we are more and more aligned with this nature of the essential life, so to speak, the Tao principle, right? And in that Tao principle, there is a time, where, we go into this phase of creation. There's a time, for which we sustain that creation. And there's a time when that, sustenance gets destroyed as well. And when we stop listening to it, in a way, we are always listening, right? But, for whatever reason, when that listening gets clouded, we move away from it, then naturally, we start extending those cycles, from a very empirical perspective, start extending those cycles or start shortening the cycles. Maybe we could become impatient and we really want to finish the cycle sooner, than what it is, and so on, right? And, and all of that really creates more and more impressions, right? In a way, like it creates more and more avenues for different kinds of traumas to happen, different kinds of stories to happen, and so on, right? I mean, the essential principle of, in a way, of spirituality is really, like when you're hungry, you eat, when you're tired, you sleep, when you're wanting to walk, you walk, and that is just, there's a natural cycle, because then we are not necessarily just living as a very separate individual. We're still part of the entire cosmos, and there's a flow to that. And
Okay, so if I'm listening to you and I'm hearing what you're saying, let's say that I make a commitment to something. That may not be an eternal commitment. So if I'm really deeply listening to the natural cycles of the cosmos, I will know when the time for that commitment has completed itself. This is the time to release. And I can wait until that time happens versus becoming, like you said, impatient and cutting something off before that natural cycle sort of completes itself. Am I hearing you right?
Yes, indeed. And, I just want to add one thing with that, is that the idea of creation, as a very individual being, when we create something, right? And I'm going to make it very tangible. Let's say, like, I'm starting a new project, right? When I'm creating a new project, I have an idea in my mind that this is what the project is about and this is what it's going to do, and so on, right? But I think, when we have done it enough number of times, we actually realize that there's actually a much larger story that is also unfolding at the same time with that project that we started. So when we started this project, we always imagine how the project would be, when it's ready and finished and so on, right? But in the larger story, maybe there was something else that needed to happen, that was meant to happen with this project creation. And maybe your role, really, as an individual person, your commitment to it was just to start the project, So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's the listening part. Sometimes, I know I've done it many times. I've got attached to my creation and, continued longer than I needed to. And I forgot to see that there was a larger story that was actually playing here.
I don't know exactly how to ask this question. It seems like there are cycles that we don't really have that much control over that happen to us, nature's cycles and larger, bigger cycles. But then, like you're saying, there's these cycles that we can initiate ourselves through creative action and so forth. And somehow it seems like one of the goals is to get them to fit together, are the ones we initiate and the ones that are happening in the larger context of the world we live in. I was wondering, like Krishna's teaching in the Gita is a lot of emphasis on the renunciation of the fruits of action. I was wondering if you might say something about that in the context of working in harmony with nature, as well as not getting caught in the destructive side of your, like when you get, if you get attached to something, then somehow it's going to get ripped away from you eventually. So that ends up being kind of a, a traumatic experience, I think. So can you say something about renunciation?
Yeah, thank you, Cliff. Two things right here. Like when we talk about ourselves as individuals who are very separate from the all, then as individuals we act. There's actions that we do. There's things that we need to do and so on, right? The entire experience of the cosmos are happenings, are acts that happen, right? And I think at least one way to understand this is to really understand, what is the difference between acts or happenings and actions, right? We have full control over the actions that are happening as individual beings. We have full control over the actions that are happening. Seemingly as individual beings, because we are separate, we don't have any control over acts or happenings that are happening, and when we sort of see the world from that perspective, then naturally, and I might be going into a lot of different things here, but naturally that actually sort of motivates us to act in certain ways, that gives us our moral and ethical standards on what is right and what is good, what is bad, what works, what doesn't work, and so on, right? And the nature of karma is actually defined by that. So karma is essentially when we actually start assigning value propositions to a nature of actions, like it's good and it's bad and so on, and so on, right? But the moment when we realize that we are actually not separate from the all, right? When we are in harmony, and when I say it's not just a mental realization, right? It's a entire realization. So what I'm saying is when we are actually moving from doing to being, and being in entirety of of a full integrity and really being in that way, right? Then then there are no value propositions, because there isn't a natural sort of concealment of things. It's like this is good or this is bad, this is right, this is not. It's just in harmony with what is happening. And naturally, when we do that, as who we are, the self actually starts creating these kind of linear cause and effect that shapes how things move. And one of the ways to see it is, and it's not a very satisfactory way to see it, but over the history of time, there have been specific people who have really shaped history in certain ways, right? And that's because a part of them acted in a way that was actually in harmony with, that the story of the collective, or the story of the bigger group that was actually happening. Now, of course, like when we talk about ethics and morals and things that we want to preserve and all of those things, right? I mean, it becomes pretty questionable and very complex as to what a role is and things like that. But really, it comes back to really listening, who we are, what is it that is really who am I meant to be, and what is it that I'm meant to be doing? What is the divine asking me to do? When we really frame those questions as to what am I supposed to do, or what am I, what should I do, versus what the divine is asking me to do, it really changes, our experiences. And really, one of the first things that really help with that is identifying where in that process are we getting attached towards, So the idea of one of the things that I heard is that there's an idea of attachment towards creation itself. There's an idea of aversion because of that attachment. Now there's a value proposition, right? There's an aversion to destruction, right? But I mean, in nature, that's just the nature of life. You cannot get moral mushrooms if there's no forest fires, and who knows how many beings and how many things get destroyed in a forest fire. But you do get moral mushrooms only after the forest fires, right? So it's there's so many examples with that, right? But that's but obviously we don't like destruction because we are primed in a way, we're conditioned in a way to really appreciate just the creation and maintenance. And the thing is, we can't really appreciate creation and the flourishing of life if you don't understand the natural death and the natural completion of cycles and the natural destruction of thoughts, ideas, ego, life, and so on.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful answer to my mixed up question.
Mary, do you have a comment, a reflection you might want to make on this idea of completing cycles? Or
thank you, Peeyush. What stuck in my mind is that we're doing all of these things every single day. And like you said, there are multiple actions in our lives in the same time frame that things may be completed while we're in the middle of something else. So it was kind of, to me, it's just a reassuring that, we're all in this world together. We're all on the journey. We're all at different paces, at different sections of that path. And we're all going to get to enlightenment and grace, and everything will be, what it's supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That's a beautiful reflection. I love that.
Roger.
I've been in and out of the conversation and I came in late and I apologize, but one of the reasons I wanted to tune in, because I've been fascinated for quite a while and kind of working with the idea of a cycle of the entire cycle of Asian, the horoscope, and the idea of 60 years and 5 elements and 12 animals, and this celebration in Japan, for instance, called Kaneki. When you hit 60, they give you a red coat because that's what they give babies. You've completed one cycle and now you're starting another. And I've read some things on this, and I was also looking at cycles in terms of the 1960s, which was also 60 years ago, and how we seem to be in another era that could be quite as significant and powerful as that. And I wanted to just ask what he thought about that idea of the recurrence of cycles giving you an opportunity to focus on what might be coming and how you might deal with it better the next time around. And I'm sure there's lots of nuances on this. Obviously, this is not the 60s. We played that out that way, but there's obviously some astrological connection in these 60-year patterns, or it wouldn't have been in the culture there in Asia for thousands and thousands of years. So,
yeah, thank you, Roger. Probably many ways I can share my perspectives on that. I hear about the 60-year cycles as well. I think if you look at like Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions or something like that, right? I mean, they follow 60-year patterns in astrology in terms of, how they actually traverse the zodiac and so on, right? I think like this last conjunction that happened, it's supposed to be pretty significant because we are moving from a very, Earth-based conjunctions that used to happen with Jupiter, Saturn into the more of an air-based conjunctions and so on. And there's so many other patterns and cycles that are at play, right? I mean, it's just regular planetary cycles and so on, right? Now, really, like the this might seem a little off, but the knowledge in any way, like any knowledge, it is actually always double-edged in a way. It's a double-edged sword, I would want to say. In the entire experience, right? In the entire experience of living a very fully connected life, I mean, these are all concepts that just happen to be, right? life is always changing. I mean, even the astrology cycles and all of those things, they give us some diminished perspective of the entire continuum of life, right? But this diminished perspective is probably still pretty expansive compared to our, individual life that we perceive through our eyes and ears and taste and so on, right? I mean, it's still bigger than that, but in the entire realm of the consciousness, I mean, they're still diminished because the way we respond to any situation when we are completely in the recognition of our non-duality with the divine, that cannot really, you cannot really map that into very tangible things because that's an infinite experience. It's like, how do you map a very continuum things into like very discrete ideas of thoughts and ideas and so on, right? So understanding these cycles and seeing these cycles and harmonizing with these cycles, and in a way, recognizing these cycles the way they might happen in the future, they can give us very important information. How do we interpret that, and how do we live with that? That really comes back to us and our understanding and our sort of coming back to the presence, where we are really. And I think that is the key of knowledge as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Renee, and thank you so much, Peeyush. I had the pleasure of being in the Gayatri Mantra deep dive with you. And when Renee is talking about planting seeds, I feel like every time I hear you speak on one topic, there are subtopics upon subtopics upon subtopics of which I would love to go into another discussion. But I think that this presentation of completing a cycle and the ideas that you presented around cycles themselves and the idea of the 5 acts has given everyone here quite a lot to think about. We appreciate your insights and your perspectives so much. So I will look forward to the next time that you can grace us with your presence.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Renee, and thank you, everyone. Really, I mean, it's always a pleasure to come here and share my perspectives and hear from you all as well. And also, I want to have a special gratitude for my friend Miku as well, who introduced me to this beautiful center as well. And I see Miku with her mama. So
yeah, feel free to open your mics if anybody wants to say a little something before you sign off. You're welcome to.
Thank you, Peeyush. For now, I am complete.
Thank you, David.
So happy. Love you so much. Thank you so much for your talking. Thank you, and nice to meet you. I heard a lot about you from Miko.
Likewise, pleasure to meet you as well. Thank you.
Maurice.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful cycle. It's a lot, gave us a lot to think about, and we appreciated the way you very gently and lively kind of presented a lot of really complex ideas in ways that can live within us. So thank you so much.
Ways that can live within us, not just think about them, but ways that they can live within us. That's beautiful, Maurice. Yeah, it feels like that.